U.S. and Iran have so far paused strikes for the third day in a row. No strikes from either side after nearly 2 straight weeks of nightly bombing. And this comes as U.S. officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, are warning about the dwindling supply of U.S. air defense munitions. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations also weighing in, saying President Trump is giving diplomatic efforts a chance.
What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level.
CNN's Zach Cohen is joining me now. Zach, he also said, that the U.S. ambassador to the UN, that the troops have all they need when it comes to this fight with Iran. But we're hearing about these dwindling munitions. What's the sense of what's going on here, Zach?
Yes, Sarah. Ambassador Waltz did say that the U.S. has all the munitions it needs, but that does not line up with what we've been reporting, frankly, since back in April, when analysts and Pentagon data has shown that the Pentagon's munition stockpile, including these key missile defense systems, are running low because of the high frequency with which they're being used during this war with Iran. And while the White House and the Trump administration is arguing that this temporary pause over the last 3 days is intended to give space for diplomacy, we've learned new details about a consequential meeting that took place at the White House on Friday when discussions were being had about potentially escalating the conflict with Iran. All of the president's top advisors were in the room, we're told, and there were some hard truths laid out for the president by both Vice President J.D. Vance and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, both of them warning about potential concerns related to the options for escalating this conflict. And Kane, in particular, pointed to these warnings about the U.S.'s diminishing stockpile of key munitions, saying that if the U.S. continues to use them at the clip that they've been using them so far in this conflict, they may not have enough for the next war, especially if it's against an adversary like China or Russia. Now, this is just one of the concerns, we're told, that was raised during this meeting on Friday that ultimately preceded the ongoing temporary pause. The other concerns that were raised included potentially massive amounts of civilian casualties inside Iran if the U.S. were to follow through with Trump's threat to strike civilian infrastructure, things like power plants and bridges, things of that nature. We're also told that concerns about retaliation against Gulf energy infrastructure and a broader regional escalation were also mentioned. So ultimately, those concerns all taken into account seem to have led to this current pause, but there's still so many questions about whether or not diplomacy can ultimately get back on track and bring an end to this war.
This reporting that CNN has, I was just speaking about with Betsy, about the concerns raised by Vice President Vance and General Kane, concerns specifically about munition stockpiles. Ambassador Walt, in part, was blaming that on aid that the U.S. has given to Ukraine. A, it doesn't seem like it's that simple, but I'll let you answer that question. But B, what does this tell you about the overall impact on U.S. military readiness?
Well, there's certainly an impact, Erica, on U.S. military readiness, no doubt about it. But let's put things into perspective. When you look at the expenditure of Patriot missile munitions in Ukraine, you're talking in the hundreds of Patriot missiles that like PAC-3 type missiles that the Ukrainians have used. Compare that to as many as 1,430 Patriot missiles that were sent off in the war against Iran. So the U.S. itself has used a considerable number of munitions in this Iran conflict, Operation Epic Fury, and both pre and subsequent operations. So we really have to figure out the defense industrial base in this country. There are serious concerns. General Kane and the Vice President are absolutely right about that. The key question, though, is that we have a long lead time in putting all these weapon systems together, building them, manufacturing them, getting the money allocated for them, and then, of course, finally getting them into the field. So those are the kinds of things that have to be fixed. The Pentagon is making strides in that direction, but the key thing here is also this. There were efforts under the Biden administration and before even the first Trump administration to do some of this, but there have been some holdups, some of them congressionally induced, some of them bureaucratic inertia that have prevented that. But if the U.S. had decided to focus on Ukraine, for example, instead of Iran, we probably wouldn't be in this situation.
talk about where things stand then now with CNN Global Affairs analyst Brett McGurk. He's also the author of the new book coming out, Brink, Inside the Race to Free the October Hostages. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here. So let's talk about, they're in a pause moment. That seems to be, I think, the only clear thing when it comes to the status of this war, because 2 weeks of U.S. bombing runs on Iran have seemed to fail to break the deadlock over the Strait of Hormuz still. And now you have reporting that there's this concern that was raised this week about further depleting munition stockpiles if the president escalates this further. How do they navigate a path forward now, Brett? What do you see here?
Kate, it's tough. We're 5 months tomorrow. We'll be at the 5-month mark of when this conflict started. And I had a saying when I used to work in the White House for various presidents, from General Eisenhower when he was president. He used to say, before we talk about decisive military action, lay out all the facts cold and hard. And it appears from the reporting from CNN and elsewhere that this meeting late last week did that and said, here are all the factors as we consider next steps. That's good. That's exactly the type of information a president should be getting. It's probably the type of meeting that should have been had before this started. But where are we now? I would call this, Kate, a tactical pause. I think we had 13 nights of strikes. There are back channels open through Oman and other to try to get the strait back to where it was before those strikes started 2 weeks ago. And that, I'm told, they're making some progress. So a tactical pause, let's see where we are, see if diplomacy can get somewhere. But otherwise, we're still kind of stuck because the key variable remains the Strait of Hormuz. And if Iran is not going to is going to maintain that the Strait of Hormuz is its sovereign territory, it controls what goes through the strait, I don't see Washington accepting that, nor do the Gulf states accept that, and therefore you're kind of stuck. So it's a big week, Kate. We got visits coming to Washington. Netanyahu's here, Zelensky's here. We'll see the diplomacy go, but right now, tactical pause.
Where do you think things stand right now, and do you think that this pause in the strikes could perhaps lead to some diplomatic progress?
The pause in the strikes, of course, is welcome, particularly for people, civilians who are caught in this war. It is an indication that the U.S. administration wants to give talks a chance to succeed. And they have said that holding back is giving the diplomats that chance. However, the Iranian side has clearly activated the Houthi militants in Yemen. When the war started in February, the Houthis largely have stayed out of it. This goes back to the Iranian playbook, which is to use different proxies at different times to exert pressure. And this is more familiar territory for the Iranians. Usually they would not get so directly involved in conflict, but have one of their proxies really apply pressure, which is what we're seeing the Houthis trying to do. But also we have a couple of militant groups inside of Iraq also now saying that they will enter the fray. So it's a very cautious moment to say that we are at a return to the ceasefire. Not fully there yet, but it has been good to see 3 nights of no direct military action from the American side or the Iranian side.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you mentioned the civilians too on all sides here, especially when we're just seeing one escalation after another for nearly 2 weeks. So then in your view and your assessment, Mina, how long do you think this pause is likely to last?
Well, the pause will last as long as there is hope for the talks to change the dynamic. The concern is that the pause only then allows one side or the other to drag it out. There is very little trust from the Gulf here, from the wider Arab world and the US when it comes to the seriousness of the Iranian side to actually bring about a diplomatic resolution. So with very little trust, we don't know how long this can last before, again, this last flare-up started because Iran targeted vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. So as long as there can be an agreement not to escalate, let's not forget, we're still in the 60-day window that ends on the 17th of August that was set by the Memorandum of Understanding to get to a longer-term deal. We're nowhere near getting to that longer-term agreement and deal. And so how long it lasts will depend on how serious all sides are, and particularly whether Iranians will stick to what they signed up to in the Memorandum of Understanding, which is to allow the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz.
And it will soon now be, 5 months since both the U.S. and Israel carried out those initial rounds of attacks, starting this conflict. And I say this because soon we'll see those two leaders of those two countries meeting again. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu heading back to Washington, meeting with President Trump. What will you be looking out for as these two leaders meet? And I'm sure what happens in that meeting will largely determine what the next chapter in this conflict may be.
Absolutely. It will be important to see what they come out with in terms of statements, but also what is the strategy when it comes for the American interests in this war, not necessarily the same as the interests of Israel, and particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, who of course is always thinking about the next elections and what would suit him best as a wartime Prime Minister of Israel. So it'll be important to see not only how they deal with Iran, but also Lebanon has been incredibly important. President Trump just received the president of Lebanon, Joseph Aoun, in the White House, and the Lebanese desperately want to see Israel withdraw from Lebanese territories, but also to have peace come back to Lebanon. So I think the Lebanon element will be important, but of course, the bigger agenda item is Iran. Palestine, unfortunately, will likely not really be top of the agenda in these meetings, but it is important to the wider dynamic in this region. When it comes to Iran, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very hawkish, whereas we've seen that President Trump is keen to get to a diplomatic resolution. We've seen them have disagreements before. It'll be interesting to see how they come out of these meetings and whether, again, American interest to bring about a diplomatic resolution will match what Prime Minister Netanyahu will be advocating for during those meetings.